afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I'll try to share my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. I'm not allowed to share my screen.
Yes, that's important. Yeah, I'll get that done. Let me make you a co-host. You want to try that now? That should be okay.
Okay, can you all see a slide that says navigating the change? Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I should introduce myself. Yeah, so I'm Johannes. I'm a senior researcher at Founders Pledge, leading the climate research. Essentially, the question that keeps me up at night is, where should we spend additional money on climate? Which is really what this talk is about, and particularly how this has kind of changed over the last year, and where we think right now more money will have the biggest effect. That's really kind of the question that we are working on all day and some nights. Okay, cool. This is the menu for today. So first I'm going to talk about key facts and uncertainties about the current moment and climate action and climate philanthropy. Then I'm going to talk about emissions in the 21st century and promising theories of change that kind of are a reaction to emissions in the 21st century. And then about our own grant making and how you can help. Some caveats. Obviously, all of this is teamwork. So actually, Louisa, who's someone on the climate team, she's here. Violet isn't here, but she's also contributing to this. And a lot of this has also been informed by discussions with other people. For example, John Halstead, who's going to give the next talk. Yes, and also all of this today is kind of, or most of this is hot off the press. So it's stuff that has literally been written or researched or visualized over the last couple of days. So it doesn't look as pretty as it should be, or all guinea pigs and the first ones to kind of see this content. Okay, and I'm gonna really focus on updates. So I'm not gonna explain things that I've kind of explained in many times before. So for example, I'm not gonna talk that much about innovation just because I've did that many times before and I've kind of linked that. And yeah, obviously, let's keep it as informal as possible and ask questions when they come up or yeah, after the first and the second section. Cool. Let me kind of start with key facts and uncertainties and really what kind of characterizes, what we think characterizes kind of the current moment in climate action and climate philanthropy. And the first one really is that climate action and philanthropy have really changed rather dramatically over the last year. So we've just seen the most significant US climate bill that has ever passed, the infrastructure bill. The second one, which is hopefully going to pass, the Build Back Better plan, which is the second part of the infrastructure package, would probably be even more significant. So in any case, this is like probably the most relevant or most significant moment in US climate policy to date. We also see this very clearly in kind of venture capital investing, for example, in the United States for clean tech is up 50% this year. Obviously, we see action in Europe, so that's not so surprising. It hasn't really changed as dramatically. But of course, also over the last year, like last year, China's net zero commitment for 2060, and then this year, this COP, India's commitment to go net zero in 2070. And all of these trends are really quite different, and I think it's really important to, I guess, emphasize this, that the situation has really changed quite dramatically compared to even say like 3 or 4 years ago. And this is also true, which I think is the most relevant thing for us with climate philanthropy. So essentially, climate philanthropy has probably doubled this year. So in October, there was the Climate Works report, like this October, 1 month ago, on climate philanthropy up to the end of 2020, where the estimate for 2020 was 1.9 billion. Unfortunately, this report is kind of outdated because essentially this year there have been so many new commitments that it's kind of hard to build analysis based on this data, which is why we did our own analysis, kind of including major new commitments that I'm going to present to you today. So climate philanthropy is doubling, or climate philanthropy by foundations has doubled this year. And obviously this does affect what is neglected, what we can do, what we should expect the effects of our actions to be. And yeah, just to make this a bit more concrete, you can kind of look at how climate philanthropy has changed over the last year. And so the red numbers, the red bars here are kind of new commitments, old and new commitments, so including commitments up to philanthropic commitments up to this COP, and mostly reflecting kind of Bezos. On the one hand, the Bezos Earth Fund, which kind of has really shaped climate philanthropy, and on the other hand, the Global Energy Alliance for People and the Planet, which is a major commitment for renewables in developing economies. So, and if you kind of look at this chart, and we're not going to go into the details of all of those, but like just, I guess, to give a sense that in principle, really you can kind of see how much. So everything that's all the difference between red and blue is always just like stuff that has kind of changed this year in terms of annual spending. So how much this has really changed. Obviously, a lot of Bezos funding has been focused on the US, but then also with the Global Energy Alliance, a lot of new funding for renewables, renewable advocacy, or renewables generally in developing economies. Yeah. But it's still, so climate philanthropy still overall remains quite focused on the US and Europe. So the US is about 35%, Europe is about 10% of climate philanthropy. Yeah. And here you can kind of see this across sectors. So across sectors of the economy, or also like kind of strategies that one might choose. You can see a very clear explosion for attention to clean electricity, which is most of its attention, over 90% of that attention is renewables. And you can also see this some other sectors. So for example, a lot of the Bezos commitments right now have been to like natural climate solutions, to forestry, or to other natural climate solutions. So this field has changed rather dramatically through kind of the influx of new money from the Bezos Earth Fund. And yeah, so this kind of means that while there is a lot of new money in climate philanthropy, it's kind of really focused on a couple of key segments. And there are still a lot of other segments that remain quite low funded. And this is kind of what you can see here, which is really when you kind of combine, on the one hand, the countries or the regions, and on the other hand, the sectors. And so what you can see here, what you couldn't see kind of in the sectoral or regional per se, is that there are a lot of kind of combinations that are almost, where funding is almost non-existent. So roughly speaking, there's of course a lot of attention to renewables, and now kind of also across the world. There's a lot of attention to natural climate solutions. There are a lot of other sectors of the economy where there's almost no attention in terms of climate philanthropy, at least not outside the US, the EU, and China. So essentially everything from industry, transport, buildings, etc. is like pretty much empty for much of the world, right? So like there's a lot of focus on renewable electricity. There's a lot of focus on natural solutions, but there's still a lot of like spaces, a lot of kind of sectors of the economy, a lot of parts of the world, but there's very little climate philanthropy targeted at like tackling those sectors and those emission sources. And so this is really the second kind of key fact. So like climate attention has really increased very strongly, but that doesn't mean there isn't anything that's neglected anymore, because the funding kind of remains very unbalanced and the intention remains very unbalanced. And this is really important in terms of what we prioritize, how we use additional money. And the third crucial fact about climate, and that's not a new fact, but it's kind of still, it's like a crucial fact, is that climate damage is likely quite nonlinear. So what this means is that if you're in a world of like 5 degrees, for example, this is not twice as bad as a world than 2.5 degrees. It's like several times worse. And for example, like a world of 5 degrees and a world of 1.5 degrees, the difference is probably something like 30 times worse in terms of climate damage. So even though like a world of 5 degrees at this point is probably quite unlikely, because overall kind of emission trajectories have like trending downwards, still, because it's so much worse, it can kind of dominate our expectation. Most of the damage can be in those worlds. Just to kind of make this a bit more concrete with one example. So We currently estimate, and this is all going to be in our new report that we're going to launch on Tuesday. So we currently estimate that there's about a 10% or so probability that we're kind of on the trajectory right now towards something like 1.5 degrees or 1 to 1.5 degrees, what is described as RCP 1.9 by the IPCC. We think the probability for kind of a worst case scenario for something like 8.5, RCP 8.5, which translates to something like 5 degrees of warming, is only about a third of that, something like 3% or so. It's actually quite remote. But still, because the damage of that world is like 30 times larger or so than kind of in the 1 to 1.5 degree world, if you kind of do the math, like if you multiply the probability and the damage, the expected damage kind of from the high risk scenario is higher. So it's kind of more valuable to reduce damage in those worlds or to reduce the probability of this world occurring, even though it's kind of much less likely. And the reason that this is so important and why this is important also for like what we should do as philanthropists is because we actually know a lot about worlds where we're kind of ending up in a 5 degree world, and we can kind of exploit that knowledge to think about what strategies we should prioritize. And this is really what this chart is kind of trying to show. So this is kind of a very stylized example, and the numbers here, unlike in the last one, the numbers here are not intended to be like realistic numbers. They're just illustrated to kind of try to make a point. So there's kind of two uncertainties here. The first one is, are we on a 3 degree scenario or on a 6 degree scenario? And both of those cases in this stylized example have the same likelihood. So like tossing a fair coin. Tossing a fair coin, sorry. Then there's a second question, which is like, have mainstream low carbon technologies, so such as renewables, electric cars, etc., have they succeeded or failed? Again, it's like a 50-50 chance. But those two things are not independent of each other. So it's like very hard to end up in a 5 degree world and mainstream technologies having succeeded and vice versa. It's very hard to end up in a 6 degree world and mainstream technologies having succeeded. And you can kind of see this here. So like the probabilities of those combinations are much more likely of the typical combination. So either technologies succeed, like mainstream technologies succeed, and we're in a 3 degree scenario, it's much more likely, or we fail, we're in a 6 degree scenario, and mainstream technologies have failed. And remember again that these are kind of the worlds, the 6 degree or 5 degree worlds, where like most of the damage is kind of, most of the climate damage is concentrated. And so this is actually really important because it shows us something about the actions that we should kind of prioritize, or what's really the most important thing to focus on. And yeah, what do we actually know? Because I kind of say here, okay, we actually know things about those worlds where things have failed, where most of damage is. Well, so when shit hits the fan, so like when we're in kind of these worst worlds, we can kind of infer a couple of things about those worlds, because if those things are not true, we don't end up in those worlds. First one is kind of mainstream climate diplomacy has likely failed. So if we're in a 5 degree world, the Paris Agreement has fallen apart because it's not like overshooting the Paris Agreement by a little bit. If we're going for 5 degrees, it's like something has happened. We also know that mainstream technological solutions have likely failed, and with failing, I mean here like they have like not like exceeded expectations. They have kind of come to a halt. So it's possible that like renewables are like 50% of electricity, but like they don't go further than that, and the rest kind of remains carbon intensive of the economy. Something like that is kind of included here. There's probably a lot of energy intensive growth in emerging economies, because that's kind of the only way to get to really high emissions, globally speaking, like if the entire world would kind of emitting at the American per capita level, for example. And another option is kind of there has been like a growth explosion. So for example, an AI-led growth explosion or another kind of growth explosion. So those are kind of typical things that that we should expect in kind of those worlds where we have failed. And we should think about, when we think about solutions, solutions that kind of still work in those worlds. And yeah, this is kind of, sorry for the text, this is really just a quote from the upcoming report. But really, what are kind of the major implications of those three facts? That the tension is increasing very strongly, that the attention is very unbalanced, and that the damage is very nonlinear, and what we know from that. And I think that the primary implication is that if all of those things are true, then like the plausibility space for high impact philanthropy, climate philanthropy, like what is plausibly like the best action you can do as a philanthropist cannot really be like improving a mainstream solution or increasing attention to a mainstream solution by 0.1% or something like that. Like this is just like exceedingly implausible that this is the most effective thing that you can do. Like we're not going to fail because we're now, let's say we're allocating 500 million per year to renewables in developing countries, which is kind of what this commitment is. We're not going to fail because these weren't 510 million. On the other hand, like it's much more plausible we're going to fail because, well, we were quite unbalanced in our societal response to the problem, and there's lots of solutions that we're not emphasizing, such as, for example, we're allocating 500 million to renewables in developing countries and 0 million to advanced nuclear in developing countries, right? A situation like this, which is like quite unbalanced. And this kind of means we think that if you think about the plausibility space for high impact climate philanthropy, this plausibility space really only contains solutions and approaches that are considered controversial, speculative, or remote. Like if it's kind of all of the mainstream solutions, you should be very skeptical that this is kind of the best thing that you could do because it's just, yeah, exceedingly plausible. Yeah, that's kind of the first part. And we can have questions now.
Cool. Okay, I'll just ask people to read them out from the chat because some of the questions are a bit longer. It'll just be much easier. Kian, is that how you say your name? I don't know if that is, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think you had a question about sustainable finance. If you want to ask it out loud and give any context.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Kian. Good to see you, Johannes. So you had this point where you talked about the distribution, and I was really surprised that sustainable finance had such a small proportion. I would have thought people who are quantitatively minded, and especially large donors, would be very interested in leveraging private finance and sort of large scale capital flows. So I'm sort of wondering, am I missing something? Is that a really major potential way of getting a large amount of action if there's even a small amount leveraged? Thanks.
Yeah. So I mean, just to clarify what those numbers are. So those numbers is like this is foundation funding, right, from climate philanthropy, right? So this is this is not sustainable finance itself, but this is kind of philanthropic funding that is kind of oriented towards what you're saying, leveraging sustainable finance, etc. I'm not sure those numbers are low though, right? If you compare them with other numbers in that chart, I mean, they're low because I think most of what you could do in this space is kind of funding think tanks or think tank-like organizations, right? Which is like not a massive funding gap. Like there's nothing like you cannot build concrete of sustainable finance advocates. So I'm not sure I would agree with your assessment that this is like low. I think it's kind of one of the more popular approaches. And we looked into this, and I couldn't really find an angle to this where I thought like, okay, it's great to like spend more money there.
Cool, thank you. And Herbie, I think you had a question as well, if you want to go for it.
Hey, sure. So my question is really about like in the modal future, let's say 2.5 to 3 degrees, might be this distribution of like impacts, probably a distribution whereby there are some really unlikely events at that level of warming, but which could be quite bad. And therefore I was wondering, like, could you take this into account when like deciding what to focus on? Because maybe like the chance of I don't know, some simultaneous crop yield failure in the 3 degree world might be higher than the chance overall of a 5 degree world, simply because the 3 degree world is more likely, even though the crop yield failure is less likely in the 3 degree world.
Yeah, so I'm not quite, I think something I said before, like, I think you shouldn't take those numbers overly literally, like, so like I'm not making a Jason statement about the 3 or the 5 in precision. But I mean, I think the only kind of feature of the curve that I'm kind of exploiting for the argument is that the damage is like increasing non-linearly, and So like, yes, we could be in a situation, I think that's what you're referring to, where like the 3-degree world is so much more likely that it's kind of dominating the expectation. And I think this might be true for comparing 3 to 5 degrees. This is why my example kind of focused on 1.5 degree and 5 degree, where I think it's almost certainly not true.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. And I think one more question we had so far, also if anyone else has, pop it in the chat, is, again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, please correct me, is Shmuel. That's right. If you want to ask it out loud. Or not. I'm not sure they're still in the room. So maybe let's skip that for now, because then there's no point in them hearing an answer. Oh no, Shmuel is still here. Okay, well, maybe do you want to read it, Johannes, or?
Sorry.
Well, the question now, it's like, why do you think human society needs to trust in climate matters on philanthropy of private foundation? Why, according to your opinion, the treatments of problems of climate states and governments can't invest directly? So I think it's asking why philanthropy versus state and government investment.
Oh no, there's no philanthropy, like there's no philanthropy versus states. So okay. Yeah, I usually always make this point. I didn't make it today. So philanthropy is like 100 or so of like or less than of like entire like social resource mobilization for climate. So like including government spending. And the primary point of philanthropy, certainly as I understand it, is to improve how societal resources are allocated. So like it's kind of improving how the government response is, or how the response of other large actors is. So yeah, in principle, government and we as collective have to solve this problem. And the only way that philanthropy can be highly impactful in this is if it's kind of improving how the resources are allocated.
Cool, sounds good. And I actually had one question as well. I don't know if that was in the slide you said, don't take these numbers literally, but something about you said there's roughly a 50% chance that the mainstream low carbon technologies fail. Is that something that you think is like roughly accurate, or if so, like what do you think is based on?
No, this was just an example. Like this was just
cool.
an example where like it was kind of the maximally easy example where you have
cool.
two times 50-50, and then you have very different results for the joint scenarios. I would put that scenario, that probability, probably somewhat lower than 50%. Yeah.
Cool. Worrying, but interesting. Cool. Okay. I think if there's no more questions, you can go on to part 2, and then we'll do more questions after that.
Cool. Yeah. So this part is kind of about emissions in the 21st century and promising theories of change here for high impact climate philanthropists. And yeah, so this is kind of our current best guess on what emissions in the 21st century will look like by world region. So what we did here is like we looked at all of the different IPCC scenarios and kind of assigned them a probability based on the literature and based on our own assessment, kind of combined that. So this is not one particular scenario, but that's kind of the expectation. And what you can see is here, yeah, this is probably something like a 3 to 3.5 or so degree world, which is kind of also what right now kind of is the model, as kind of the expected scenario. And in that kind of case, China is about 25% of emissions. EU is something like 7. US is something like 11 or 12%. UK is something like 1% or so. So yeah, emissions are clearly not dominated by where most of us are. I think that's clear. Even though of course, we bear most of the historical responsibility. So this is not a point about responsibility. This is a point about what we should recognize when we like try to do the most impactful things. So that's kind of by region. The second part is kind of by sector. How are emissions distributed according to sectors? So this is kind of what is pretty close to the current distribution of sectors. And the couple of sectors here are like highlighted as hard to decarbonize. So that's stuff like iron, steel, cement, aviation, shipping, long distance transport, load following electricity, which means like electricity you can turn on and off, i.e. not wind and not solar. And so those are kind of considered hard to decarbonize sectors. They're about like 27 or 28% of current kind of energy and industry emissions. But of course, on a business as usual trajectory, those sectors are kind of decarbonizing more slowly. So they're kind of their share is kind of increasing. So just to give an example, light duty transport, like by cars, is going to decarbonize over the next 10 years. And that's kind of happening, right? That's already kind of baked in. Electric cars are going to take over, and that's going to happen. Maybe it's going to happen in 7 years, maybe it's going to take 12, but in any case, this is going to happen. We don't have a trend like this for aviation or shipping, for example, right? So that's kind of what this is about. So that this also tells us something about where do we need more attention, where do we need more effort. And I think the argument that we would make is you need most effort in those sectors that are hardest to decarbonize, because those are not the things that are already trending clean. Those are the things where you need to induce a trajectory change. And there's a third way to kind of slice those emissions, future emissions. And this is kind of by technological readiness, or by like where technologies are right now. And this is kind of a more marginal comparison. So this is a comparison from the International Energy Agency comparing what they call stated policies, which is essentially what countries have agreed to do right now, compared to a sustainable development scenario, which would be kind of 1.5 degree scenario or something close to that. And kind of what are the different, what is the readiness of the different technologies that would be used in this scenario, according to the IEA. What you can see here is that there's two really big emission streams, or actually not emission streams, but streams of voided emissions. So like less emissions that are related to technologies that are currently either in demonstration stage or even only prototyping stage. So those technologies together kind of contribute over 360 gigatons of savings. And this is kind of in a world like when we're moving from stated policies to sustainable development scenario, this is like very far from the worst world. This is kind of a pretty good world. So there are worlds where the importance of innovation is actually much higher because there's weaker climate policy. So this is kind of in a pretty good world. Maybe like kind of if the world continued like it is right now and even got a bit better, that's kind of what it would be. And so this is kind of really crucial. So like innovation is one of these like really big levers or technological change on future emissions. And yeah, this is kind of, if you look at public investments in low carbon energy research and development, and this is just one way, there's different ways to kind of slice that pie or to approximate this. But what you can essentially see is that the ability or the capacity, the current capacity to innovate and where future emissions are is pretty much perfectly negatively correlated. So I did this here very roughly, but if you kind of look, for example, at the EU example, that's the most interesting one. So EU 27, according to these numbers that I just showed you in the chart before, something like 46% or so of energy innovation capacity. It's about 7% of future emissions. So it makes for a pretty big difference, right? Because, and this is kind of a back of the envelope calculation. If you kind of think, okay, of those 360 gigatons that could be related to new technologies, let's say like 260 of this is already happening. So like it's not related to anything we can change. It's already kind of for our trajectory to do this. So there's only like 100 gigatons left. So like most of this is already happening anyway. But even if it's only like 100 gigatons left, of kind of saving those emissions is somewhat proportional to like innovation capacity in those countries. This would mean that the EU 27 has like a leverage over 46 gigatons of emissions over the course of the century. And to put this in perspective, right now the EU emits something like 5 gigatons, and it's already on a trajectory trending downwards, also by law and by emission trends. So this is like more than 15 years of EU total emissions. So if we're kind of people that are concerned about the climate, and our primary focus is moving kind of our net zero targets forward by 1 or 2 years, then that's maybe not the right thing to focus on, because there's so much more leverage, kind of because future emissions are so low compared to the ability to change emissions globally, that really the criterion by which to evaluate climate philanthropy and climate action more broadly in OECD economies is really what does that do for global emissions. And that's really like a key point. It's also a key point I made so many times before. I'm going to stop here and kind of move to something else. Because this is kind of, I think, I guess, the new part here. There are, of course, and like attention to innovation this year has increased. So like Bill Gates has really stepped up on this year. The book How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, but also kind of his foundation, etc. It's gotten a lot more active. There's a lot of like good innovation stuff in the infrastructure bill. So we shouldn't pretend that innovation has neglected as it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. This is not true. Like the picture around innovation has improved a lot. So at this point, we should probably ask ourselves the question, how can we still fail even if like innovation is pretty successful? And this is, of course, it's never binary, like innovation can be more or less successful, but like just like as a thought experiment. The primary way that we can still fail is if we have like really strong carbon lock-in, which means if we have like infrastructure decisions or very new assets, new coal assets, for example, even though there's now, let's say there's now cheap renewables, I mean, which there are right now, right? The cheap renewables, it doesn't mean we like shut down all of our coal plants instantaneously. Why not? Well, because a lot of those coal plants are extremely new. So they're having very low, I mean, their capital cost has been paid, they're having low operating cost. So this is kind of one example, and there are lots of those examples. And that's kind of what described as carbon lock-in. Essentially, there are decisions that we make right now that lock us out of a low carbon trajectory over decades. And this is really, I think, the primary way to think about like how can innovation succeed and we still end up in a really high warming world. Well, this will have likely been that there's really high carbon lock-in through mechanisms such as investment for decades or special interest politics or infrastructure decisions, which are even longer lived than 40 years, so like even 60 or 80 years. And yeah, you can kind of see this here. This is another one of these really big emission streams, which is what is called committed emissions. So those are emissions where essentially from existing infrastructure, say in coal plants here for the power sector or steel and cement for industry, where kind of the authors of this paper assume that the emissions will continue until the end of the natural lifetime. And what will that actually mean in terms of future emissions? And what you get here again are numbers that are like in the 300 to 400 gigaton range. So these are really large numbers. Again, for comparison, the EU is something like, the US is not that different, something like 5 gigatons a year. So, and global emissions right now are something like 50 gigatons a year. So these are really big chunks in kind of emissions in the 21st century. And that's, of course, like a really big problem. Like if all of those assets kind of run towards the end of their lifetime, we're not going to meet a 1.5 degree target, for example. So this is kind of why we are focusing now beyond kind of the innovation advocacy that we're continuing to do, but why we're kind of looking at avoiding carbon lock-in as like primary alternative theory of change that we're funding. And you can kind of see this here. Again, the basic rationale for that is, okay, in OECD countries, emissions are trending down. It's already said, and it's already a lot of policy that's kind of pushing us towards the lower end probably of that range. Whereas that is not the case in other regions here, Middle East and Africa, but also Southeast Asia or South Asia would be other places where emissions will probably increase very strongly. And that's kind of the primary reason why, because if you're here and there are like decisions that you're going to make for the next 40 years, so it's really important that these are kind of decisions that are made in the right way. Those won't be the most cost-effective actions to avoid emissions right now, but they're kind of the most effective actions, quite possibly, to avoid carbon lock-in over the long run, and especially to avoid like high emission futures. Yeah, sorry, this is again a quote from the report, and a bit too much for one slide, but kind of what does it actually mean? What would it mean to do optimal kind of carbon lock-in philanthropy or kind of optimally acting on avoiding carbon lock-in? So we would focus this on sectors that are not yet trending clean. So it's not about making electric cars win in 2027 instead of 2029. It's about making sure that we're not building a lot of new cement plants or that are really dirty and hard to decarbonize in the future, for example. It's focused on sectors of long-lived assets. and that are really hard to decarbonize. So these are kind of the primary risk from a lock-in perspective. So it's not so much about assets that like have a much shorter lifetimes. For example, cars like are replaced every 10 years or so. Those are not the primary risk of carbon lock-in. The primary risk of carbon lock-in is electricity infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, etc. And also focused on assets that are harder to retrofit. So for example, cement plants are a really good example for this, because the emissions in cement plants are not from energy. So if like energy is getting clean, or if electricity is getting clean, for example, an aluminium plant will also get clean, because the primary emission from aluminium plant are electricity. So it kind of automatically goes zero carbon if you can produce a lot of aluminium very low carbon if you have clean electricity. But that's not true for stuff like cement plants. And also the fourth criterion is that this kind of advocacy should be focused on countries where ambitious climate policy is less likely. So for example, right now in Germany, we're having lots of debates about new gas infrastructure. And I think those debates are kind of interesting and cute, but they don't really matter for emissions, because the EU will and Germany will enforce the emission targets, right? So maybe this means, okay, the EU is investing a little bit too much in gas infrastructure right now than they should, because then they have to shut it down in 10 years and they're going to lose some money. But it's not going to have like major implications in terms of global emissions. That's quite different if you're in a place where like climate policy is much, much weaker. And this is really what I kind of want to close with. That is kind of the second part on theories of change. And I think one really important thing about this theory of change is that carbon lock-in compared to innovation, that those two are quite negatively correlated, which is like an important thing. Like the uncertainties are negatively correlated. So if carbon lock-in is really severe, then innovation advocacy will be like less effective. For example, if infrastructure decisions kind of shape future emissions very strongly and they cannot be replaced by new technologies, because let's say coal is just always stays cheaper than new electricity sources that we might innovate on. Then carbon lock-in advocacy is more important, and the reverse is also true. And if we kind of think about the example of the nonlinear climate damage in the beginning, this is kind of what we would want if we like choosing different strategies. We're very uncertain about those strategies. And because the damage is nonlinear, we're choosing strategies where the uncertainties that we have about those strategies are negatively correlated. Cool. And kind of just to close, yeah, so what are we actually doing with all of this? Obviously, we're doing this research, we're publishing this research, but primarily we're trying to take action, right? We're doing grant making and charity recommendations. So like we're managing the climate fund, a Founders-led climate fund, that we're making recommendations. And yeah, just to kind of close on this. So yeah, we have 4 theories of change right now. One is kind of that I've talked about a little bit, talk about more in other talks. So accelerating innovation and neglected technologies. Second one is kind of avoiding carbon lock-in in emerging economies where emissions are increasing the fastest. Third one is around policy leadership and paradigm shaping. I didn't talk about this today. And the fourth one is about growing promising organizations, kind of acting meta and just growing really good organizations. The grants that we've made over the last year now. So we made 2 very big grants kind of directly after the Biden election, because we thought this was a special moment, and both to the Clean Air Task Force and to Carbon 180 to kind of push for neglected tech innovation in the infrastructure packages. And yeah, we're going to publish a retrospective analysis on this once both of those packages have been passed. But like right now, it looks like this has been really useful. This year, we're incubating a new organization, Future Clean Tech Architects, which is a German energy innovation policy think tank. And this kind of comes out of the observation that I mentioned, that I think innovation is becoming less neglected, philanthropically certainly, but that it's considerably more neglected in the European context. So like in the US, I can mention at least 5 different think tanks working on innovation and innovation on hard to decarbonize sectors. In Europe, it's really hard to come up with a list of names like this. So this is kind of why we're investing and future clean tech architects right now, because they're really very strongly focused on hard to decarbonize sectors and or don't have like the connotation with European policymakers that they're like what Bill Gates is doing, that they're ultimately an American outlet operating in Europe. They're just a European outlet operating in Europe. Yeah, we made another grant, or in the process of making a really fairly large grant to the Clean Air Task Force to kind of go global, to do work on essentially in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, in Middle East and North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. This shouldn't come as a big surprise after what I've talked about now. And of course, one thing to note here is not only are we focusing on those kind of regions where most of the future emissions are, but also, and what's kind of outstanding about the Clean Air Task Force is that they are kind of focused on all of the solutions that are not popular and that are underfunded. So yeah, it's mostly going to be, if you recall the graph, like the empty spaces in this graph, and this matrix graph, industrial decarbonization, clean electricity sources other than wind and solar, etc. Like they're going to focus on this, reaching out into those regions. We made 2 grants related to COP26 that I've talked about in a recent blog post. And we made an organizational development grant with Terra Praxis, which is really just focused on growing this organization, because we believe right now the climate philanthropy space is surging, and big organizations are not really funding constrained. And we think kind of one of the most valuable things that you can do right now in the climate space is to fund small organizations that are doing really promising work, because if you're kind of improving their organizational capacity, I mean, for Terra Praxis, we're literally paying them a fundraiser and an operations officer, because we believe that this is probably like more effective than just funding another program, because this will allow them to kind of crowd in more money and grow faster and kind of profit from this special moment in climate attention. Yeah, and how you can help. This is really the very last slide. Obviously, you can give to the climate fund. It's possible through EA funds, but also, and then my time stopped. But also, like, really happy about any kind of ideational support, talking about the fund, but also providing inputs. So, for example, one of the grants that I didn't talk about today, sorry, came actually from a fellow London EA. She kind of came to us with an idea. So also always happy about kind of any ideas like that. Cool. That's really it from my side. Questions?
Great. Thank you so much, Johannes. That was super, super interesting. And we got loads of questions in 10 minutes, so we'll see what we can get through in this period of time. But the first question from Colin is about, I'll just read it out to be quicker. Isn't the speed of technology rollout another important variable, I think, in relation to your innovation point?
The speed of technology rollout, yes. So when we're talking about innovation advocacy, we don't only mean like basic R&D. We very much also mean like early deployment policies, which are kind of targeted at those sectors. I think what I find less plausible is that this is true for pretty mature technology. So for example, I think we would have focused on, like, let's say if we had existed 15 years ago or 20 years ago, we hopefully would have been like great advocates for solar advocacy. It probably like seems very unlikely to me that right now kind of the primary constraint to emission reductions is that there aren't enough advocates for more aggressive solar deployment policies, for example. So it kind of is really, I think the support has to be at the early stages, and not when the dynamic is already set in. Does that make sense? Does it answer your question, Colin?
He's nodding yes. Cool. Thumbs up. Great. And then Alex had a question about, should we encourage more EAs to found for-profit startups trying to tackle difficult, neglected climate areas, even if most of them fail?
Yeah, I got this question a lot. I'd say probably not, to be honest, because I mean, that's also something I didn't talk about so much today, but like I think in principle, the private sector is not the bottleneck. So like right now, there's a lot of private money, there's a lot of ideas right now, like which is kind of a reflection of uptick in the public sector. So you think improving ultimately, like improving the public sector response is kind of the more important thing. And right now, I mean, money that's going into climate and going private, like private money going to climate, is increasing so strongly that would be quite surprising if like the bottleneck would still be like people with ideas doing stuff, I think.
Sorry, it was actually people doing things. Like those cement companies aren't public companies. Those are private companies, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But I mean, like the reason that you get like the way you get more of those companies, or that you get more like innovative companies, is that you like kind of fix the energy innovation system, right? It's not that like if the energy innovation system like works well, like if there's enough like public support for those things, then like, I mean, private companies are going to do a lot of the innovating, but like whether or not they're doing that is primarily a function of like the public infrastructure for this existing. And this can be stuff like tax credits, you know, like these are private companies that are profiting from tax credits, or that are profiting from expectations that there's going to be like public procurement for their product later. So it's like, even though the private company does the work, the private company is not the causally relevant factor.
Yeah, I'd like to discuss that more with you sort of offline, because I'm curious about that, especially with cement, because I think you said it wasn't energy with cement, but we can talk later.
Cool. Also, Johannes, maybe do you want to stop the presentation, then you can see everyone's face again, might be easier as well. Another question from Kate was about, I think in the section of if innovation fails, what may other reasons we end up in a high warming world? You said carbon lock-in, but she said, what about natural feedback loops? Don't know if you have anything to add on that.
I mean, natural feedback loops, right, are about the, I guess they are about the climate response system. So that's not something we can directly affect. I mean, that would, of course, I mean, if one is very worried about natural feedback loops, then one would invest, I guess, either in geoengineering, or one would be like more worried about stuff like making sure emissions get down really fast, rather than kind of minimizing cumulative emissions over time, for example. But my current understanding is that overall, like if we kind of look at climate sensitivity at large, which encapsulated this, kind of the range of uncertainty is kind of narrowing, which means that the more extreme feedback loops become less likely, or like that the scientific understanding is that this is like a bit less likely than one was thought previously.
Cool. And Colin had another question about what is the track record for countries meeting their climate pledges? Seems like we're assuming that most people are going to follow through with their commitments, but I was under the impression that most countries had failed to implement policies that resulted in significantly reduced, failed to implement policies that resulted in significantly reduced emissions.
So, I mean, I think we really need to be like, that's a really important point. Like, the question is like, how much would we need to fail? So, like, and also you need to think very differently here about OECD countries and India and China 2060, 2070. So like in the EU or in Germany or in the UK, like maybe we fail the targets, but like we'll fail the targets by like 5 years or by 10 years. That does not change anything materially in the calculation. So like this kind of doesn't matter. And like, I mean, if the current like geopolitical and climate situation stays as it is, like I do think the like domestic pressure in those countries is actually really high. So like in a way, whenever like I think about an emission in the EU in the future, like I think this is much less affectable than an emission somewhere else, just because policy is kind of determining the emission trajectory to such a large degree. I mean, even if that were not true, the major conclusions would still be the same. Like it would still be the case that in the EU or the UK or the US, you should prioritize indirect effects over direct effects. But I think this is like a pretty strong effect. I wouldn't make the same assumption about China and India, right? Otherwise, you could kind of say, okay, we can't really end up in a 3-degree world or 5-degree world if we kind of said, okay, those pledges are legally binding and will definitely be followed. Of course, they're not.
Is that backed by the record? Like, I think I recall from the Kyoto Protocol days that the only countries that matched their pledges were the UK and Russia, and Russia was because the collapse of USSR dropped their industry dramatically, and the UK was because they discovered gas in the North Atlantic Sea. Like, weren't everyone else increasing emissions at that point still?
I mean, but this was the Kyoto Protocol, right? So like, I mean, right now, like essentially this was like an international agreement at a point where attention to climate overall was much, like domestic attention to climate was much lower than it is today. So if we look at the UK situation right now, post Kyoto Protocol, we have like a national climate law that is like set into law that sets the emission trajectory. We have an institutional structure that enforces that there's attention to this. And so something similar like in the EU soon. So if we kind of look at those cases, like we should not evaluate them by what happened with Kyoto over 10 or 15 years ago. We should really look at what is happening right now. And like, of course, there's a risk from like a deterioration of the overall climate attention. This is why I give RCP 8.5 like a 3% probability, not a 0.1% probability, like kind of accounting for the fact that the climate situation overall might change quite strongly, like the attention. But if the situation stays roughly as it is, kind of, or if the trend kind of roughly constrains as it is, like we should assume that countries like the UK do stick to their commitments. Maybe they're doing a bit of arithmetics here and there, and like, or maybe they need 5 more years. But like the track record in the UK and also in the EU is kind of okay. Those targets are being taken quite seriously, and there's quite vocal constituencies that make sure that those targets are met. This is quite different from the Kyoto situation 10, 15 years ago.
Doesn't that depend a little bit on the cost that they're actually facing? Right now, it's pretty cheap to say that you're going to reduce emissions 40 years from now. But I know, like in the US, like, you know, we can't even raise gas taxes. So I guess, I don't know, I think it's worth considering, like, whether if this becomes more difficult to reduce emissions, whether countries continue to follow through with them.
Yeah, I mean, the US is also like, I mean, the US has no 2050 target, right? And also don't expect a legally binding 2050 target. Like, I mean, that's also the reason why I'm like 4 or 5 times more worried about US emissions than about EU emissions.
Yeah, I would just also like legally, what does legally binding mean when a country is hitting it binding on itself? Like, what actually happens to the people in prime ministers of the UK if they don't meet this target? Do they go to jail? Like, I don't think it's like legally binding really means much in that context.
Yeah, but I mean, in a country like the UK, legal binding doesn't mean a lot, right? Like, and I mean, it's not only legally binding, but it's legally binding plus like constituency pressure, right? So that's, I mean, this is where, I mean, why I would say like in the UK or the EU, like there's legal targets and there's a lot of political pressure. So
what actually happens if they fail their legally binding target? Like, I get the constituency pressure, that makes sense, but like, there's like, who enforces that binding? And what actions do they take based off meeting or missing it?
Yeah, but I think like the crucial bindingness here always comes from public discourse and public pressure, not from the law. But I think that's what we see with the Paris Agreement, and that's why the Paris Agreement has been really successful, even though the like legal status is really weak. It's really focusing attention on specific targets in countries, and like in countries with strong climate policy, like the UK and the EU. This is like a tremendous political force that doesn't guarantee that those targets be met, but like, yeah, I would quite a lot would need to change for like the EU to miss its targets by like more than like a couple of years, and like for that to matter, and like that's not climate relevant on the climate scale.
Cool. Okay, it is 7:01. I don't want to keep people too long because it's their Sunday evenings. Maybe we'll wrap it up there. There's a few more questions, but I'll keep recording going. Maybe if I took a screenshot of the question, so maybe if there's time, I can ask Johannes to answer them, submit by text. If you don't have time, that's totally fine. We can chat afterwards about that. But the final closing things is I just put a few links in the. Well, first of all, actually, thanks, Johannes, very much. That was super informative. There's so many beautiful graphs in there. I'm looking forward to seeing that real report. It's like, wow, there's so much to dive into. So that should be good. But yeah, and I'll share this recording afterwards in the email, so people can see, a bit more detail. I'll go through it again if they want to do that. And yeah, I put a few links in the chat. One was the Effective Environmentalism website, where you can sign up to the newsletter and see various things. The newsletter is probably the best place to go. That's on the Get Involved tab. And also there's a Facebook group if you want to hear about upcoming events, like I mentioned. There's a link there. And also the next talk with John Halstead is also linked in the chat as well. So there's a few things. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This was super, super interesting. Loads of great questions. Shame we didn't have time for everyone, but hopefully we'll get a few more answers later on. And that is everything. Thanks, everyone. and have a nice weekend and evening.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Right.